Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's installment of the UNM Department of Anthropology Colloquium series. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to read the UNM land acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. Okay, so today it is my pleasure to introduce somebody who is probably very familiar to many of you, Stephanie Fox. Stephanie received her Bachelor of Science degree in 2012 from the University of Toronto, a master's degree in 2015 from the University of Calgary, and since 2016, she has been a PhD student in the University of New Mexico Department of Anthropology in the Evolutionary Anthropology subfield. She is a primatologist, and her research seeks to understand variation in social bonds between and within species, how animals change their social strategies as the costs and benefits of relationships change throughout their lifetime, and what this can tell us about the origins of human social behavior. For her dissertation research, Stephanie's work has focused on wild female chimpanzees in Kibale National Park, Uganda. Stephanie has been the recipient of several impressive and prestigious research grants, including from the Leakey Foundation and the Wnr-Gren Foundation, and she has authored and co-authored several articles in major anthropological, primatological, and animal behavior journals. At UNM, Steph has recently been the recipient of the Ruth Kennedy Award, and today her talk is part of the conditions of receiving the Ruth Kennedy Award. So Steph, thank you very much for being willing to do this today, and congratulations on the award.
Thanks, Ian. Ian, do you mind just going to the participants panel and just making sure that everyone is muted? I don't think I can do it as a participant. And in the meantime, I will share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. So thanks for that lovely introduction, Ian, and thank you to the department for the Ruth Kennedy Award. And thank you everybody for spending your Friday afternoon with me talking about female chimps. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my dissertation research, which is about social relationships among female chimpanzees. I am in the midst of writing my dissertation, so most of this work is in progress, but I've pulled together some results to share with you where I could. So I want to start by highlighting this familiar idea that humans are exceptionally social and cooperative. So we live in large groups, we have extensive social networks, we can maintain relationships over long distances and even over large gaps in time. And we're quite cooperative. So we share food, we have cooperative breeding, we team up to defend our groups against others. And we also move between communities in ways that mean we are usually living amongst both family and non-relatives. So we are regularly forming cooperative and friendly relationships with both kin and non-kin, which is somewhat unusual in the animal kingdom. So all of these things are really central to what it means to be human. And this attracts a lot of attention from anthropologists. We also know that our social ties are directly tied to our health and longevity and reproductive success. So for example, there's several large-scale studies now that have demonstrated that individuals who are more socially integrated have better health, live longer, and on the other hand, individuals who experience loneliness suffer from worse morbidity and worse mortality. And further, this study by Abby Page and colleagues demonstrated that some measures of social integration in mothers was associated with higher reproductive success in two populations, the 𝗖𝗂𝐵𝗂𝐺𝐻 and the 𝗭𝗂𝐻𝑇𝑎. Similar patterns have been demonstrated in several other social mammals. So it's not just humans, which suggests that this pattern that we see in humans has deep evolutionary roots. But interestingly to me, many of the studies in non-human animals have focused on the connection between sociality and health in females. But also in these studies, females are often the philopatric sex, so the sex that stays in their natal group throughout their life, and the other sex disperses at sexual maturity. So in these studies, females are often the philopatric sex, and we see the strongest connections between kin. So it makes me question whether females are for some reason more reliant on social connections, and that's why we're picking up this pattern, or if it's more so related to the availability of kin and the prevalence of female philopatry among social mammals. But within species, we do see differences between males and females, and both the importance of social ties and the way that they are used, including in humans. But a lot of the evolutionary minded work to understand this between sex and between species differences has again focused on the influence of kinship. Additionally, a lot of the research that has aimed to identify the evolutionary benefits of social relationships has come from species where individuals form strong, obvious connections, meaning that we mostly understand the benefits of strong bonds. But sociologists have, for several decades now, recognized that weak ties also play a significant role for human social lives. So weak ties are often thought of as useful because they're often bridges between social groups that have tighter social ties. And therefore the weak ties can serve as like a path for the flow of information and resources, making them quite useful. But we're also starting to learn more and more that weak ties can also contribute to our sense of happiness, our sense of connection, belonging. And you can imagine that this is getting quite a bit more attention since March 2020. But that aside, I'm interested in weak ties because I'm interested in understanding the range of ways that organisms can benefit from social connections. And I'm particularly interested in understanding more about the value of weak ties, not just compared to strong ties, but on their own, like when strong ties aren't available, and also the value of weak ties among unrelated individuals. So I study social connections in female chimpanzees. So why female chimps? First, female chimpanzees typically disperse from their natal community at sexual maturity. So they live among unrelated individuals as adults. So we can learn something here about the ways that females form new relationships when they move communities, or the value that bonds among unrelated individuals can have, and also how these relationships could be maintained in the absence of kin selection. Female chimps are interesting because they also provide a model where we could study the value of weak ties. Because unlike male chimpanzees, and unlike females in several other primate species, female chimps are known to have relatively weak social relationships. So these relationships are fairly subtle. There's not a lot of like overt indicators of affiliation like grooming, yet relationships are differentiated. So there are social preferences that are still apparent. And even with these relatively weak social relationships, we do still see some cooperation, although this too is quite rare. And there is already some evidence that subtle social interactions are important for female behavior, because we already know that they manage to maintain a stable dominance hierarchy, despite the fact that they don't interact aggressively very often. So that's how a dominance hierarchy is normally maintained. We also know that the dominance hierarchy has implications for their reproductive success. So being higher ranking is beneficial. So we have this sort of trajectory where we have subtle or rare social interactions that support some kind of social structure that does influence their reproductive success. So there has been a fair amount of theorizing about why female chimps have these relatively weak relationships compared to females in other primate species that are philopatric. And the main idea is that they just don't really need them, because they're able to manage competition over food largely by just avoiding each other. And they can do this fairly easily through fission-fusion dynamics. So chimps don't have to stay in one group all the time. They can split off into smaller groups or even just travel on their own. Also, because of the way that food is distributed in their environment, it's probably just not very advantageous to team up and defend food resources. So that is what we see in many other female philopatric primates like baboons and macaques. So this is one idea to explain their relatively weak relationships. Another idea is that female chimps are constrained from forming strong bonds because of competition over food. So this idea largely stems from research on bonobo females, which is chimpanzees' sister species, who are comparatively very social. Okay, and so it's been proposed that this could be because over evolutionary time, bonobo females have somehow been released from the constraints of feeding competition that female chimps face. So then bonobo females can be more gregarious, more social, etc. So we have sort of two ideas here. Are female chimp relationships weak because they aren't very useful? Or is it possible that they are useful, but they're constrained by competition over food? It's not really about pitting these against each other. It's not one or the other. These ideas are probably interconnected. But I'm just trying to illustrate here that we have maybe a cool opportunity to understand what is happening, what is shaping these relationships among females who don't live with kin. And ultimately, this is helpful because we want to know more about the different circumstances that can lead to different types of female social relationships across species, and that will tell us more about what our own evolutionary trajectory might have looked like. I just want to take a second to point out that the title of my talk is meant to be a tribute to the work of the scholars that have come before me, and whose work I'm directly building on. In particular, I think it's kind of cool that this year marks 1/4 century since 𝗭𝗵𝗵𝐶𝗵𝗵𝗆 published this influential article, which demonstrated that these dominance hierarchies that were somewhat difficult for people to detect for a long time actually had implications for female reproductive success. And so in the same year, Richard Wrangham wrote this commentary about the work. And since then, many more scholars have worked on female chimpanzees or researched female chimpanzees, including my advisor, Melissa Emery Thompson, who gave a talk titled The Secret Lives of Female Chimpanzees the month that I started this PhD. So just reflecting back on that, I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants. But of course, we always have more questions. So for the next section of the talk, I'm going to walk you through 3 questions that I'm trying to address with my dissertation research. The first is about how we can effectively measure social relationship quality for female chimpanzees. So I'm going to talk a lot about weak ties. I've already been talking a lot about weak ties, but what are weak ties? And do they have any sort of defining characteristics other than just being not strong? Then I'm going to ask whether or not those weak ties could potentially support cooperation. Is that one potential benefit of these relationships? And then I'll talk about whether or not female chimp relationships might be energetically constrained. And I'll just add that beyond my dissertation research, I'm really interested in also how these things and how the costs and benefits of social relationships change for females as they move through different phases of their life history. So specifically, I'm quite interested in how female chimps move from being an adolescent, a subadult female in their natal community to a new female in a new community who doesn't have any kids, and then moves into motherhood, this whole other phase of their life. And so I think those probably change the costs and benefits of relationships. So that is sort of a future direction, big picture type of question. So for my dissertation research, I've been quite lucky to work with the Kibale Chimpanzee Project and study the Kanyawara community of chimpanzees who live in Kibale National Park, Uganda. So this is a long-term research project where I've been able to work with a 10-year data set of behavior on 29 adult females. Plus, I've been able to work with and contribute to a matched data set on hormone measurements from urine samples, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. And in addition to the long-term data, in 2019, I collected 1 year of data where I was able to collect even more targeted and detailed data on the social behavior of 18 females, the 18 females of the 29 who were still in the community when I was there. So let's talk about measuring relationships. When I talk about measuring relationships, what I really mean is that we are making observations of these animals, and then we're making inferences about what those observations might mean about the dynamics between those two individuals. So we think about like the frequency or the types of behaviors and what that might mean for their relationship quality. And there's 3 measures that are typically used for quantifying relationship quality for chimps. And these are 3 measures that I can calculate using information available in the long-term data. So the first is party association. I mentioned earlier that chimps have fission-fusion social dynamics. So like humans, within their community, they're aggregating and then subdividing into subgroups regularly over the course of every day. So we can look at how often a pair is found in the same party as one measure of their relationship quality. So on this histogram, the y-axis is just showing the number of pairs of females, whereas the x-axis is showing our relationship strength measure, which in this case is party association. So we can see that there is variation between pairs and how much time they spend in the same party. This is probably something like the average amount of time that females spend in the same party, but then we have a few dyads out here who spend quite a bit of time together. But generally speaking, we consider this to be a more coarse grain measure of relationship quality because individuals might gather for many different reasons, possibly attraction to each other, but often like mutual attraction to a fruiting fig tree. So we can look at a finer grain spatial measure, 5-meter association. And so this is how often 2 individuals are within 5 meters of each other, given how often they're in the same party. And again, we can see that many pairs are rarely near each other, but we have this nice long tail, so there's quite a bit of variation, and some females who spend exceptionally high amounts of time near each other. So hopefully this reveals a little bit more about partner preferences. It's a little more clear. We assume that individuals who like each other or are more comfortable around each other are going to be spatially associated more often. But at the very least, we think that this should tell us something about tolerance of each other. So if they don't necessarily love each other, they probably are at least willing to tolerate each other and tolerate one another in each other's space. So third, we can look at rates of grooming. And this is a common behavior used to measure relationships in primates, widely interpreted as a clear sign of an affiliative relationship. But you can see for female chimps that most dyads never groom. So those that do groom don't really groom that much. And then you can barely see, but we have a few dyads out here who groom an exceptional amount, but it's a very few dyads. So even though grooming is a very telling behavior, at the same time, it's hard for us to depend on this to distinguish relationships for female chimps because so few dyads even groom at all. So we generally do use a combination of all three of these measures, but for female chimps, it seems to me like we're kind of relying heavily on this 5-meter association index, which we sort of assume is telling us something about tolerance. But I'm interested in sort of digging into this a little bit more using some additional behaviors that might help us distinguish those relationships in more meaningful ways. So expanding on this idea of tolerance, in the animal behavior literature, most people think of social tolerance as being best reflected by sharing food or water in close proximity. So not only does this require the absence of aggression, allowing individuals to even come near each other in the first place, but on top of that, it might mean establishing some sense of predictability and familiarity with your partner. So building tolerance with each other could maybe lead to those individuals being more at ease around each other. So for example, one study in female kangaroos shows that females who have closer relationships with each other are also able to have longer feeding bouts when they're around each other, and they're less vigilant, so they're not looking up cautiously. They're less vigilant during feeding. So you can think of this like they are more efficient feeders because they're less nervous around each other, something like that. So we could maybe apply this to female chimps to get a better idea of variation in social tolerance rather than just relying on what we think the 5-meter index is telling us. So during my year of data collection, I recorded bouts of co-feeding between females. And I also recorded behaviors like scratching and vigilance behavior, which are kind of indicators that an individual is agitated and pretty well accepted in the animal behavior literature as a sign of stress. So I call these nervous behaviors. And here we have in this photo, Wangari, this adult female who is co-feeding on this nice patch of figs with Wanka. Wanka is actually her adult daughter. Presumably, if they were intolerant of each other, it would be fairly easy for one to at least shoo the other away, right? And in this histogram, I've just put this here to sort of demonstrate that I am seeing quite a bit of variation in the rate of co-feeding that we observe between pairs. So some pairs never co-feed, but amongst those that do, there's some nice variation there. So I am optimistic that this will help us distinguish relationships a little bit more clearly. And similarly, with the nervous behaviors, I'm hoping to see if we can pick up a signal of whether or not females seem more agitated or more comfortable when specific other females are in their close proximity. Okay, so let's talk about weak ties and cooperation. So female chimps occasionally cooperate by forming aggressive coalitions. A coalition is when you have two or more individuals aggressively teaming up against another. It's aggressive, it's cooperative, it's a joint action. And for female chimps, these are usually against females who are new and trying to immigrate into the community, or to counteract harassment from adolescent males. And studies in other primates and studies of male chimps have shown that coalitions tend to occur between more closely bonded pairs. So in this paper, we are interested in whether coalition formation maps onto other social preferences in female chimps, even though female chimps have these comparatively weak ties. And this paper has been submitted to a theme issue at Philosophical Transactions, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about later. So to address this question, we started off by using the long-term data, where we were able to look at 163 coalitions over the 10 years of data. And so first, we just looked at a correlation between relationship quality and coalitions. So we take our 10 years of data, we divided it into 2-year periods. And then for each period, we just counted the number of coalitions that each pair formed. Okay, so some pairs formed many coalitions, most pairs never formed a coalition during the period. And then we calculated our traditional relationship strength measures for each pair during each time period. And we just ask if there is a positive correlation using fancy models, of course. So I mentioned that we used the traditional measures of relationship quality as potential predictors of coalition formation. So we have party association, 5-meter association, and then for grooming, I've divided that into 2 measures. So first we have a binary measure of whether the pair groomed at all during the period. And then we have a continuous measure of how much time the pair spent grooming. Because grooming occurs so rarely that by including both measures in the model, we're able to determine the effect of grooming at all, but also among those who groom, whether or not the frequency of grooming predicts coalition formation. So, as I mentioned before, we think that these measures reflect sort of different intensities of relationship strength, which gives us some different predictions. So we thought, if relationship strength doesn't really matter that much, and females just form a coalition with whoever is available, then we expected that party association, which basically represents partner availability, would predict coalitions. So this is actually what we see in female bonobos, who form a lot of coalitions and don't seem to preferentially choose individuals who they associate with more or groom more. They form coalitions with whoever's available. But we thought, if weak ties are important, so some level of social tolerance between a pair increases the chances that they'll cooperate with each other rather than somebody else, then we expected party association, but also 5-meter association and grooming presence to predict coalition formation. And if strong bonds are really important for supporting coalitions, then we expected that we would see a positive effect of all 3 of these measures, plus a positive effect of grooming duration. Okay, so females who spend a lot more time grooming would form more coalitions. So I think of this kind of like we have increasing levels of how important relationship quality is for cooperation. So here we have 4 graphs where each graph is, on each graph, each dot is 1 pair of females in 1 time period. And on each graph, the x-axis shows a measure of relationship quality, and the y-axis shows the number of coalitions that the pair form. For the continuous measures of relationship quality, these are z-scored, so that means that 0 is your average strength, okay? So it turns out, when we ran our analysis, that party association, 5-meter association, and the presence of grooming did positively predict coalition formation when they're in a model altogether. So this is congruent with the idea that socially tolerant relationships do support coalition formation for female chimps. But I want to look at this graph of grooming duration for a minute because it's a little bit deceptive. First, remember 0 is our average. Here, 0 is way over on the left because remember most dyads don't groom, so the average rate of grooming is very, very low. But we actually do have some dyads here on the very far left. Those are the ones who actually never groomed. They're actually below 0. So that's the first deceptive thing. The second thing is that this is just an increasing confidence interval here. The actual line predicting the relationship between this measure and coalition formation is flat. So this is not a positive relationship, which in and of itself is also interesting because it's kind of striking that females who groom more and have stronger relationships don't form more coalitions. So this suggests that strong ties are not necessary for female cooperation, but also they don't even bolster female cooperation. So I'll add one more thing here, which is that because chimp females occasionally do stay in their natal community and reproduce there as adults, we had a few pairs in our analysis who were related to each other, some moms and daughters and a set of sisters. So we could test for the effect of kinship. And we found that kin dyads were actually no more or less likely to form coalitions than expected, considering their relationship quality. So this is also kind of striking because that's quite different from, for example, baboons, where kinship is such a strong predictor of coalition formation that if you put measures of relationship quality in a model with kinship, they're not even significant because kinship is such a good predictor of baboon female behavior. So I'll just briefly mention that we did do a second analysis in this paper where we wanted to more directly control for the effect of opportunity on partner selection in coalitions. So what we did is, on a finer scale, we conducted what I call the opportunity analysis. So we looked at each coalition that was formed and looked at all of the females available in the party at that time, i.e. the females who had the opportunity to form a coalition together. And we asked whether relationship quality predicted whether females were more likely to select each other as a coalition partner out of the available females at that time. So if we imagine that this is our party of female chimps, we have these 2 females in gray here who formed a coalition. So we assigned them a 1 for coalition formation in our analysis. And then we looked at each of the gray females with each of the other females and assigned them 0s because they did not choose those other females as coalition partners. So we do this for each coalition, and then we paired that with the same relationship strength measures for the relevant 2-year period. And then we could use a logistic regression to ask if partner selection was predicted by relationship strength. And the results of this analysis mirrored the results of the first analysis, so I'm not going to go into it, but I just want to to discuss it because it's important that we feel fairly confident that the results that we're presenting aren't driven by opportunity alone. So the results from the study suggest that female chimps are able to leverage relatively weak relationships for cooperation. So this could be one way that these relationships, despite being relatively weak, could be beneficial. And this is kind of cool because not only is this occurring among unrelated females, but even those females who are related to each other didn't seem to deviate from this pattern. We also have a little bit of a puzzle though, because we do have some pairs who form quite strong relationships, and they don't seem to benefit from those relationships in terms of coalition formation. So it's possible that these relationships are beneficial in some other context, which is definitely worth some future investigation. So overall, female chimps seem to have this unique path to cooperation that's different from their male counterparts, different from female bonobos, different from female baboons and macaques. And this is cool to me because it kind of highlights that there's diverse ways that social processes can shape cooperation. But if tolerant ties are helpful and presumably require little investment, why don't more pairs form tolerant relationships more often? So I mentioned earlier that one idea is that female chimps are constrained by feeding competition. So this is the idea that in order to meet the energetic needs, their energetic needs, perhaps it's more efficient to just avoid one another rather than face the energetic costs of sharing food and sharing space. And as a result, they're just less gregarious, and this means weaker social relationships. So this is the hypothesis. So here's one idea of how we might investigate this. We know that females' energetic demands are not constant over time. We know that pregnancy and lactation are associated with higher energetic demands, and that when females are breastfeeding during the first 2 years after an infant is born, this is a particularly expensive phase of reproduction. And this is something that Melissa has been able to map using markers of energy balance that we can measure from urine samples. So if it is the case that females' social lives are energetically constrained, we might expect their social behavior to fluctuate in accordance with energetic demand. And we would expect then that they engage in less social interaction when they're facing the highest energetic demands during pregnancy, and even more so during that early lactation phase. So here's a graph showing you the time that females spend socializing. This is socializing with anyone by reproductive state. And if the first thing that strikes you is that there's not a lot of variation here, we are on the same page. So female chimps, they do get sexual swellings when they're cycling. So on the x-axis here, we've divided cycling females into females who do not have a swollen sexual swelling and females who are swollen. Then we have pregnant females here, early lactation females here, and late lactation females here. And you can see pregnant females do seem to be a little bit less social, but there isn't as dramatic of an effect, and there's definitely not an effect of early lactation. So this might be a little bit of evidence against the energetic constraints idea, but it really isn't the best test of this question either, because there's a number of other reasons that females might adjust their social behavior according to their reproductive state. For example, if during some states they want to avoid the risks of being in large groups, or also we don't necessarily know, although we know that the energetics of reproduction changes over time, we don't necessarily know that it's extreme enough to cause a change in behavior. So that's okay. We have a bunch of data that could do a better job of answering this. So from both the long-term data and my dissertation data, we will be able to look at female energy balance by measuring a molecule in urine called C-peptide. And this tells us about energy availability on a smaller time scale. So we can avoid using these large proxies for energy constraints. And then we compare that with matched data on social behavior from that same time scale. And so this will enable us to more directly ask how social behavior and energy availability correlate. So just to recap on the 3 questions that I have presented to you, we think that weak bonds in female chimps may be best characterized by social tolerance. We've demonstrated that weak bonds can support cooperation, and a more direct test of the energetic constraints on social relationships is on its way. And just to sort of wrap things up, I want to step back and think about how the type of research that I'm conducting can inform our understanding of the evolution of social relationships in women, which is ultimately the goal. So I think about this happening in 2 ways. First, as I mentioned earlier, by simply understanding how variation in female relationships corresponds to variation in socioecology across species, including chimps, bonobos, and many other model species, including other primates, we could start to identify patterns that will allow us to make inferences about what environments produce behaviors that we see in human women. Second, if we see common patterns or common behaviors between humans and other closely related apes, this would suggest that these behaviors were fairly likely to be present in our last common ancestor here. Alternatively, if we find things that are different, then it would suggest that these are behaviors that might have evolved after we split off from what turned into chimps and bonobos. And so then we are asking a question about what changed during this phase of human evolution. But to do this, we need good information on many species, and that includes humans. And when I was proposing my dissertation, I thought, I will just go and read about what humans are doing. I'll find some review that's probably already synthesized on social relationships in women, and I'll just go from there, because it seemed to me like this type of research, it gets a lot of public interest. It seems like a very popular thing to research. And in a sense it is, but I was kind of surprised when I wasn't really that satisfied with what I found in the literature, because our descriptions of female social relationships in humans largely come from psychology research, which largely focuses on studies of girls or women who are mostly college age, mostly don't have kids, mostly living in industrialized societies, mostly individualistic societies. And it isn't to discredit any of that research, but just to say that it really struck me that our narratives about the biology behind women's social lives might be missing a lot of nuance. For example, about the ways that women might flexibly respond to different socioecologies, and how women's social strategies might shift across the life course. By the way, just as an aside, of all of these, I actually do really recommend this book by Lydia Denworth. It's quite good. So this issue is, of course, not just important for the accuracy of our ideas about the evolution of women's social behavior. Incomplete evidence is easily taken out of context and can generate misleading narratives that have important real-world consequences for the welfare of women. Because gendered stereotypes that are reflected in and reinforced by biological characterizations of females do influence public perception of women's behavior. But what's more is that it seemed to me like a lot of anthropologists and researchers in other disciplines probably had that more diverse, more nuanced data on women's behavior that I just couldn't find, or maybe it wasn't published, maybe it wasn't synthesized, maybe there was not a lot of sharing of common language. So I was having a hard time finding it. And so somehow that has led to me leading a theme issue in Philosophical Transactions that focuses on synthesizing evolutionary and cross-cultural perspectives on cooperation in women. So we bring together research from behavioral ecology, anthropology, developmental and social psychology, and behavioral economics to hopefully build a more complete view of the roles of cooperation and competition in the lives of human women. So this is really just my shameless plug for this special issue because I'm excited about it. And I hope that maybe you're a little bit excited about it now and that you might go and look for it when it comes out in a few months. So I will leave it there, saying thank you to all of the institutions and individuals and funding sources that have supported my research. In particular, the field assistants and data team who work for the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, and 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗂𝗵𝗿𝗀, who was my field assistant, all exceptional humans who were all extremely helpful for my data collection. So thank you to them. That is all.
Thank you very much, Steph. That was fantastic. Does anybody, if you have a question, just go ahead and turn on your camera and feel free to ask your question. Ed, do you happen to have a question? Okay.
Hi, yes, I do. Thanks, that was great. Yeah, I was wondering, so if what's happening with chimps is, or if the thing you've identified as being most important with female chimps is social tolerance, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, about what it means for female chimps to be intolerant of each other, because you also said that there aren't that many agonistic interactions between them. So why then would they avoid each other? Why are they not comfortable, and are they you know, doing all of these stress vigilance behaviors when they're in close proximity with other females that they're not comfortable with? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, so aggression is quite rare. So, you know, it might make sense to, I think, to some people to use aggression as kind of like a countermeasure to help understand social tolerance. You would expect that dyads who are not tolerant of each other might have higher rates of aggression. But across the like 700 hours of focal data that I collected, I think I collected 43 instances of aggression between females. So it would definitely be hard to use that data. On top of that, if females hang out with each other more often, then they're often the ones who are more aggressive to each other, even if they're actually also friends. That's kind of an aside just about the actual measure. I think that avoidance is probably very important. So we don't see the aggression because they're wary and they go around each other. I have seen instances where there is repercussions, you know, of a very high-ranking female feeding in a tree and a very low-ranking female approaching her and kind of getting chewed off. So it seems like avoidance is probably the reason that we don't see a lot of interactions. I feel like there was a second part of your question that I wanted to say something about. I can't remember. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is what are the social ties, you know, what are these weak ties actually meaning, other than that they're not that they don't dislike each other? Because if it's not these sort of really close long-term grooming ties that are also leading to these to frequent coalitions, it feels like maybe it is, you know, it may be a bit closer to the bonobo situation than maybe it looks like at first glance, in the sense that as long as you're not actively wary or afraid of another female, then it's more a case of, well, who happens to be around of the females that I am not afraid of?
Yeah, I think that you're characterizing things pretty well there, actually. It's just that I think that there's a little bit more skew in terms of who you're wary of and who you're not. And there's maybe not necessarily a huge number of individuals that you're not wary of. But I will add into the mix that coalition formation isn't necessarily the only benefit of forming a more tolerant relationship. So we can go back as far as like, why are individuals in groups? It's better to be in a group for various, let's say, safety, against predation risk, but you would rather be in a group with somebody that you're more comfortable with. You can't achieve that with everyone, so you achieve it with a selective number of people. I always say people, chimps. But on top of that, like, it's not necessarily always about coalition formation. Another thing I'm interested in is the social benefits that females might gain for their kids. So I often see two females sitting next to each other. They don't groom each other. They might not even look at each other, but their kids sit there playing with each other for 45 minutes. And females who are more antisocial, their kids don't get those opportunities as often. So we actually have a paired data set on infants that I mentioned my field assistant, Natalia, collected alongside me in unison as I was collecting data on adult females. So hopefully we will get to look at that in the future. Yeah.
That would be really cool. I'd love to see that when you analyze it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Ed and Sarah. Siobhan?
Hey, Stephanie, that was a great talk. I love everything that you're doing. It's super interesting, and I'm really excited about the Phil-Trans issue too. And one thing this makes me think of is, you know, the ways that relationships are depicted in the human data and how we operationalize relationships. You know, because we have language, you might just ask somebody who's your friend or who does this cooperative thing with you. And then there are some folks who actually are on the ground observing relationships or how much time you're spending on somebody's farm, yada, yada, yada. But then, you know, there's this potential for kind of less overt, right, kinds of relationships. So you're talking about tolerance and things like that for chimpanzees, and then the kind of one-off relationships between children or between children's parents, or things like that, right? These kind of less overt forms of interacting. And I'm just wondering, you know, as you just said, like that if you are part of a group, that by itself can confer lots of different benefits, even if you wouldn't name those people necessarily as your best friend. So kind of taking what you've done in the field and thinking about operationalizing those kinds of things in humans, are there other ways we could be asking these questions that might yield different insights than the ones we have available so far?
Yeah, I totally. And actually, Abby Page is the one that inspires me on that topic, because she, for example, that graph that I showed you at the beginning about reproductive success in women, the social relationship measure that she uses there are all based on proximity trackers. So they put these trackers on everybody for a while, and then so it's not about asking at all who is your friend or who do you value or how many friends do you have. It's just about how much time you spend in close proximity to various other people, which I think is a very interesting way, like you're saying, of sort of operationalizing relationships. But on top of that, she put out another paper in, I think, 2019, where she was looking at participation, like kids' participation in playgroups. And so that's sort of where what I'm drawing on when I talk about female chimps being near each other. Their kids may actually be the ones who are potentially benefiting. And the females don't necessarily need to have a strong relationship with each other, or like the relationships that we see in other species. So I hope that kind of answers your question, or some more food for thought for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's funny, this came up the other day, actually, as we were preparing our paper for your issue, where we're looking at networks that we're calling male versus female or something like that, because they have different kind of content that's oriented around different genders. And one thing we were talking about, just in relation to our own lives and our own friendships, is that I might build a friendship with like one of my kids' parents or whatever. And then my husband ends up being friends with the parent too, but it's really my relationship that drives that. If you asked us about like lending of male equipment, like our lawnmower or something, it would look like it's his relationship that's driving that. But in fact, there's all this other stuff that's happening between me and the female partner, if that makes sense, right? So like, how do we operationalize that? How do we get at that kind of dynamic? It's just so complicated. And I think your work is really great for thinking about that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I this is something I thought a lot about actually when I was looking for research on this, and I was struck by the absence of research on it. And I kind of thought that one reason might be because of a lot of cultural variation in the way that people define their friends, or sort of are outspoken about them being important relationships, and that in a lot of cultures, women's relationships might be fairly outside of the public sphere, relatively subtle, and they might not be the spokesperson for their family, reporting their relationships to anthropologists, or maybe people weren't asking quite the right questions. So there's a lot to think about there. Yeah. Ian, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question that kind of follows up on both these previous questions. And that is, when I was thinking about how weak ties can support cooperation, and that strong ties are not necessary. Well, I was starting to try to think like, well, does that mean that the costs of not having any ties at all are actually what's driving this, rather than the benefits of the ties? Because sort of the stronger ties are not necessarily more beneficial. And then based on sort of your answers to these previous questions, I kind of rethought the question a little bit. And what I'm actually kind of wondering is whether or not there's actually a cost to strong ties if the goal is sort of like group cohesion. So do strong ties actually like disrupt group cohesion, in which case you would actually see that's sort of the cost benefit trade-off potentially, is that maybe it's group cohesion, or maybe like forming strong ties with certain individuals limits your ability to be flexible and have some ties with all individuals, something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I don't know, like the strong ties are kind of mysterious to me. Some of them are obvious. Some of them are the kin dyads. Okay, and so it's like two sisters and they spend a lot of time together. But I think that there's just some stuff we don't understand yet about why those females are even hanging out with each other so much. I don't know if it's related to like their comfort level around each other, or any benefit that they're getting, or if it's more related to sort of a history together, immigrating together at the same time, sharing space, a core area. So it's definitely something to consider. I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
Any other questions? Okay. Megan, at one point you seemed to have a question. I don't want you to.
Well, you touched on this a little bit already, but in every response, so I don't want to beat it really, but you talked about briefly life history and how costs and benefits change in different transitions like motherhood. So it just made me think, like, does social tolerance mean something different when you're an immigrant versus when you're a new mom versus when you have older kids, and like maybe those measures of social tolerance are telling you different things at different life stages?
Yeah, I don't have answers for you, but those are also things I'm really excited about and that I think about. It's something that Martin and I have talked about a fair amount, that, immigrant females maybe they might appear to prefer each other just because they aren't receiving as much aggression from each other as they are from the resident females. And then Nick Thompson-Gonzalez told me yesterday about this concept called a social convoy, I think it was called. And it's sort of the idea that you like establish social networks in your life, but then they kind of move with you through time. And so it seems very possible that that social tolerance is a little different than the type of tolerance that we see between two moms whose kids are playing. And there's a few other things that I'm interested in that I think are changing over lifespan relating to kids. So obviously, you might be interested in your kids' social opportunities, perhaps as an infant. That might change when you have your next infant, and so your social partners might evolve depending on what other mothers also have young infants, but also particularly for females who have sons who are then maturing and staying in the community. As those sons mature, the females now have a social partner who's an adult, who's in the community, and is their kin in a different way than what I've been talking about, though. And so I think that there's probably also a dynamic there that's like changing the way that females depend on other social relationships.
Yeah, I'm excited to see this paired infant data set.
Hopefully we get there.
You will.
Katie, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, great talk. I loved it all. I was wondering, my question is a little bit more, I don't know, meta, maybe. I'm wondering if you could just talk, Steph, about, I don't know, one of the things that occurs to me often when I'm thinking about what human women do is that a lot of what human women do and the influence that they have in particular situations has largely gone overlooked in the literature, I think in large part due to the fact that they're often on a broader scale compared to what men do, right? Women are less risk prone than men. Therefore, women's risk preferences get treated as uniform. Women have fewer social relationships than men. Therefore, women's relationships get treated as, kind of uniform and uninteresting in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering if you could talk about your thoughts about that with the chimp literature in particular, because it occurred to me while you were talking about this that maybe there is actually a lot more variation among the females, but really only if you're looking at them in comparison to other females rather than in comparison to the males. And what do you think about that? And like, what kinds of, I don't know, benefits are you, seeing to these females who have different strategies?
Yeah. First, I agree with your perspective on the sort of reporting of human women's relationships and the idea of trying, instead of making gender comparisons continuously, where we then end up focusing on kind of the average woman and the average man, looking at that variation within females, because that's what's going to tell us, I think within human women, the benefits vary. They vary across the lifespan. They vary depending on your own socioecology, your own sort of demographic situation. So I hope there's more research going in that direction, especially after our special issue. Maybe it gets people excited. For chimp females, it's interesting. I would say, I think like some people would say that there are some parallels there, and that certainly, like if we're going way back in, way back, but you know what I mean? That historically, you know, females were seen as having like no variation in reproductive success. And so that was kind of a big hump that we, I think, are over now. Recognizing that females have various social strategies for achieving reproductive success, and that those strategies do influence their fitness. Specifically in chimps, there was sort of that, I think, like really early on, and that article that I highlighted by 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝐶𝗵𝗆 was really influential, I think, for that reason, that we thought these sort of subtle relationships among female chimps were maybe not that impactful, not that important for them. So that's why I highlighted that paper. And I think we're just sort of, it's not me leading it, but I think that generally speaking, we're uncovering sort of more and more about the variation between females. Of course, they're long-lived and we don't have that many of them to study. So there's some things like, for example, in our community, there's at least 2 pairs of females who it seems like maybe have fed off of each other and been able to increase their dominance ranks in the community by forming coalitions together frequently. It's a case study, basically, right? It's 2 females, and it's hard to test. Like, we just think that could be the case. But I think as data accrues, we'll be able to answer those types of questions better. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Well, in that case, let's all thank Stephanie for a really fantastic talk. As always, Stephanie, your slides were gorgeous, very well put together. Everything was very aesthetically pleasing and very clear. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for listening. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good weekend, everyone.